Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're exploring a truly remarkable claim. Something pretty fascinating, actually. The idea that the arrival of two, relatively modern figures, the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh, was actually foretold. And not just in one place, but in ancient texts across major world religions. We've got sources here from the Bible, the Quran, even Zoroastrian and Hindu scriptures. So our mission today, it isn't really about trying to prove or disprove these prophecies. It's more about unpacking how followers of the Baha'i Faith interpret these really old texts. We'll look at the symbolic language, understand how these prophecies are seen to kind of converge and be fulfilled in the lives and teachings of the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh. Get ready to dive into some connections you might not have thought about before because, what we're about to uncover suggests a pretty remarkable convergence of ancient expectations.
It is fascinating, and what's particularly intriguing, I think, is just the sheer breadth of this interpretive approach. Like you said, it's not just one isolated prediction. It's looking systematically across very diverse spiritual traditions and seeing them as all pointing towards, a unified vision, a vision of humanity's spiritual and social transformation. We'll be looking into how specific details, symbols, dates, historical events are understood by proponents to provide compelling connections.
Okay, so let's start digging into that. Where should we begin? Maybe the biblical prophecies.
Sounds good. Yeah, there are many passages, particularly in the Old Testament, think Isaiah, Micah, that speak of a future day of God, a time when divine intervention is expected to bring about real peace and justice.
Right, the idea of swords into plowshares, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They picture this future where all nations will stream to a unified spiritual center, a time when war finally ceases.
So how does that connect to the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh?
Well, proponents see Baha'u'llah's declaration back in 1863, which really emphasized the unity of nations and called for universal peace. They see that, plus the eventual global spread of the Baha'i Faith as embodying this vision, the nations streaming together.
Right.
And then you've got Haggai chapter 2 saying, I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come.
Shake all nations. How is that interpreted?
That's often connected to Baha'u'llah's letters. He wrote directly to the world rulers of his time, Queen Victoria, Napoleon III, others. He called on them for justice, for unity. And his followers see these messages as having profoundly, shaken the political order of that era.
That's quite a claim.
It does raise an interesting point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How do these ancient texts, written centuries, even millennia ago, how do people interpret them now to point to specific global movements, modern calls for unity?
Yeah, how was that connection made?
This interpretive framework, it really suggests a kind of long-term divine plan unfolding. The idea that prophecies aren't always literal, maybe, but thematic, progressive.
Right, unfolding over time. That makes sense in that context. And speaking of things unfolding, what about the return of Christ? That's a huge expectation.
Absolutely. Jesus himself promised his return. But in the Baha'i teachings, this is understood differently. It's seen as a spiritual return, not a physical one.
Okay, so not literally descending from the clouds.
Not in a physical sense, no. Think about Matthew's gospel. As lightning comes from the east, so will be the coming of the Son of Man.
Lightning from the east.
Yeah. This verse is often interpreted as pointing to the Báb's appearance in Persia, which is geographically in the east back in 1844. His coming is seen as that first flash, kind of heralding Baha'u'lláh, and Baha'u'llah's teachings are then seen as the subsequent burst of lightning illuminating the whole world.
Interesting symbolism. And there are timelines involved too, right? I remember reading something about that.
Yes, specific timelines. The book of Revelation, for example, mentions two witnesses who prophesy for 1,260 days.
Two witnesses.
Interpreted as the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh. And here's where it gets numerically specific. That figure, 12,260. If you count 12,260 lunar years from the Prophet Muhammad's hijrah.
Which was 622 AD, the start of the Islamic calendar.
Exactly. 12,260 lunar years from 622 AD brings you precisely to 1844 AD.
The year the Báb declared his mission.
The very same year. That alignment is seen as highly significant.
Wow, okay. That's quite specific. Are there others like that?
There are. Look at the book of Daniel, chapter 12. It says, "Blessed is he who waits and reaches 1,335 days." Again, if you interpret days as lunar years starting from the hijrah.
So 1,335 years after 622 AD.
It brings you to the period around 1857, 1858.
And what happened then?
That's the time followers believe corresponds to when Baha'u'lláh, while exiled in Baghdad, received his first profound spiritual intimations of his own mission, those first stirrings.
So these specific dates, the geography, It's all woven together in this interpretation.
Precisely. It's compelling for those who follow these interpretations, suggesting this very precise yet symbolic roadmap unfolding through history.
Okay. And before we move on from the Bible, there was also Isaiah, right? The Prince of Peace.
Yes, Isaiah 9. The title's Everlasting Father and Prince of Peace. Baha'u'llah's followers see him fulfilling this role through establishing what they call a universal covenant of peace, laying the groundwork, essentially, for a future world commonwealth united under common spiritual principles.
All right. That covers a lot in the biblical context. Shall we shift gears now to Islamic traditions?
Let's do it. The Quran speaks quite profoundly about a day of resurrection, Yawm al-Qiyamah.
The day of resurrection. How is that understood here?
Well, one interpretation focuses on Quran 39.68, which describes a trumpet sounding twice. Proponents interpret this first blast as representing the Báb, whose title means the gate, opening the way, and the second blast as Baha'u'lláh, whose title means the glory of God.
Two figures again, like the two witnesses.
Exactly, that parallel is often drawn, and there's more. Quran 16.89 says, "We have sent down to you a book explaining all things."
Explaining all things. That's a big claim.
It is, and this verse is often linked directly to Baha'u'llah's writings. He produced a vast amount of text, apparently over 20,000 distinct works, letters, tablets, covering theology, social laws, science, mysticism, a whole new framework for society. So the volume and scope are seen as fulfilling that explaining all things.
20,000. That's
Yeah.
prolific, certainly.
It really is. And it's noteworthy how these interpretations connect versus not just conceptually, but to the actual physical output, the sheer volume of revelation.
Okay. What about within different branches of Islam, like Shia Islam?
Good question. In Shia Islam, there's a very deeply held expectation of the Qay. It means he who arises.
The Kai. And are there specific signs expected for him?
Yes, very specific attributes mentioned in Hadith traditions. Those are the sayings and accounts of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. For example, the Qayyim was expected to appear in Khorasan, a historical region including Persia.
And the Báb was Persian, born in Shiraz.
Check. He was also expected to bring a new book, a new law.
And the Báb revealed the Bayan.
Check again. It was also said he would challenge and effectively overthrow corrupt clergy.
Which you mentioned he did, challenging the orthodoxy.
He did, quite directly. And finally, tragically, the traditions also foretold that the Qayyim would be martyred.
And the Báb was executed in 1850.
Yes. So followers see a direct fulfillment of these key signs in the Báb's life and mission.
That's quite a list of parallels. What about Sunni Islam? Is there a similar figure?
In Sunni tradition, there's a strong expectation of the return of Jesus alongside another figure, the Mahdi. The Mahdi is expected to establish divine justice.
So, two figures again, in a sense, Jesus and the Mahdi.
Yes, and in the Baha'i view, Baha'u'lláh is seen to fulfill both of those roles, as the Mahdi, bringing the promised divine justice and ushering in an age of righteousness, and also as the spiritual return of Christ, bringing a new unifying revelation for all humanity.
So unifying those two expected figures into one.
That's the interpretation, yes.
Okay, this is fascinating how these threads are pulled together. Let's move eastward now. What about Zoroastrianism? That's a very ancient faith.
Indeed, one of the oldest. And yes, there are prophecies there too, specifically concerning the coming of a figure called Shah Bahram.
Shah Bahram, a world savior.
Essentially, yes. The Zandai Vohuman Yasht, which is an ancient Zoroastrian text, predicts this world savior. And it contains a particularly striking detail, something quite specific.
Oh. What's that?
It predicts that the savior figure would be born when the sun is in the astrological sign of Libra.
Libra. Okay, when was Baha'u'lláh born?
He was born in October 1817.
Which falls under Libra.
Precisely. So that detail, the Bus sign, is highlighted by proponents as a really unexpected, specific confirmation coming from a completely different tradition.
Huh. That is specific.
Yeah.
And did the prophecy also mention his role?
Yes, it envisions Shah Bahram as a prince of peace who would unify humanity, echoing that theme we saw in Isaiah.
Wow. The consistency across traditions is notable.
It is. And that detail about the birth sign often catches people's attention because it's so concrete in a way.
Right. Okay, one more major tradition to cover Hinduism. What do the Hindu scriptures say, according to this view?
In the vast tapestry of Hindu scriptures, proponents often point to the prophecies of the Kalki avatar.
Kalki avatar, I've heard that name. It's from the Puranas, right?
Yes, particularly the Vishnu Purana. It foretells the coming of this final avatar of Vishnu. and there's specific symbolism associated with him. He's often depicted riding a white horse.
A white horse. What does that typically symbolize?
It's widely seen as a symbol of divine authority, purity, righteousness, the power to overcome darkness.
And Kalki's purpose.
His main purpose is to bring an end to the current age, the age of darkness, or Kali Yuga, and to usher in a new era of truth and righteousness, the Satya Yuga.
So again, this theme of ending darkness, bringing light and unity. How is Baha'u'lláh connected here?
His teachings, with their strong emphasis on unifying humanity, establishing justice, transforming society, getting rid of prejudice, all of this is interpreted by his followers as directly aligning with the Kalki avatar's mission, marking that shift from spiritual darkness towards enlightenment and global unity.
Okay. So the white horse is symbolic of the divine authority behind those teachings, essentially.
That's the understanding, yes. It's fascinating, isn't it, how these core themes, divine authority, renewal, the shift from darkness or decline to an era of unity, resonate so strongly across such incredibly diverse cultures and spiritual backgrounds.
It really is. It highlights this maybe shared human longing for renewal, for a better world order.
Exactly.
So, okay, we've looked at the Bible, the Quran, Zoroastrian texts, Hindu scriptures. Let's try and bring this all together. What are the big patterns proponents point to when you look across all these interpretations?
Well, when you step back and look at the whole picture presented by these interpretations, several key patterns emerge. Not just themes, but some very specific details that seem to repeat or align.
Like the year 1844. We touched on that.
Exactly. That year, 1844, is a huge point of convergence in these interpretations. As we mentioned, the Báb's declaration in Shiraz in 1844 aligns number-wise with the 12,260 days prophecy in the Book of Revelation.
Right, interpreted as years.
Interpreted as years, yes. And it also aligns perfectly with 12,260 lunar years after Muhammad's hijrah, a key time frame in Islamic prophecy.
That double alignment is definitely striking.
It is. Another recurring pattern seems to be the idea of twin figures, or a herald followed by a main figure.
Like the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh themselves.
Precisely. They are seen by followers as fulfilling that biblical two witnesses prophecy from Revelation 11, the Báb as the herald, preparing the way, and Bahá'u'lláh as the primary manifestation for this age.
Okay, so dates, twin figures, what else?
Beyond the dates and symbols, there's the focus on the global impact. Remember those letters Baha'u'lláh wrote to the kings and rulers?
Yeah, calling for peace and justice.
Well, proponents see those letters not just as calls for reform, but also as containing subtle or sometimes not so subtle warnings. They believe he predicted major world upheavals like the decline of certain empires, the rise of conflict, even pointing towards events like the world wars long before they happened.
Really? Predicting world wars.
That's how some passages in his writings are interpreted, yes. Seen as evidence of divine foresight concerning the consequences if humanity failed to unite.
That adds another layer entirely.
It does. So this convergence, prophecies across diverse religions, specific numerical alignments, the concept of twin messengers, and claims of fulfilled predictions about world events, this whole tapestry is what proponents present as, well, compelling evidence for their beliefs.
It really invites you to think about history differently, doesn't it? To consider this idea of a universal thread, some kind of unfolding divine plan guiding humanity towards unity.
That's exactly the perspective it encourages, yes, a progressive revelation.
Wow. Okay, what an incredible deep dive this has been. We've really journeyed through quite a lot. We've explored how prophecies from, well, all over the place, the Bible, the Quran, Zoroastrian texts, Hindu scriptures, are interpreted by Baha'is to converge on these two figures, the Báb and Bahá'u'lláh, proposing a fulfillment of all these ancient expectations for a divine teacher, someone to unite humanity.
It's quite something to see laid out like that.
It really is. And that Baha'i concept you sometimes hear, this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future, takes on a different light maybe, suggesting these divine messages aren't just isolated moments in time, but, like you said, part of this ongoing story. Humanity's spiritual and social evolution, unfolding step by step.
That's a powerful way to look at it. And it brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. If, and it's a big if, depending on your perspective, but if these interpretations hold weight, if prophecies from such diverse traditions do seem to point towards a single, overarching divine plan for humanity, what implications does that have for how we understand faith itself? For unity? For for the future of our world.
Yeah.
It kind of challenges us to look beyond our own familiar traditions, perhaps, and search for that common thread, that connecting principle that might link them all.
A really profound thought to end on. We certainly hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe given you some new things to chew on, plenty to reflect on for sure. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.